He buried a queen and built a throne out of grief. Alpha King Draven could shatter stone with his bare hands, command 10,000 soldiers with a single word, and hold an empire together through sheer force of will. Yet he could not make his own son smile. Not once in 3 years. The boy had gone quiet the day his mother died, and no amount of power had brought him back. Now a new queen was coming. The empire called it salvation. Draven called it survival. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see where this empire reaches tonight. The kitchens of Kalor Palace ran on silence and fear, not the clean silence of early morning or the comfortable quiet of a house at rest. This was the silence of people who had learned, through hard experience, that noise attracted attention, and attention in this palace had a way of becoming something worse. Pots were set down with 2 hands and deliberate care. Footsteps moved along the outer edges of the stone corridors where the floor did not creak. Voices dropped to the register just above breath. It was a practiced silence, refined over years, passed down between servants the way other households pass down recipes or prayer. Elira Vale had perfected it. She moved through this pre-dawn kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone who understood that her most valuable skill was invisibility. 19 years old, Omega ranked by the Empire's designation, and employed in the lowest tier of palace service, the kind of position that meant you existed in the building the way a door existed, functional and unremarkable and unnoticed until something went wrong. Her hands were calloused from years of stone floors and iron pots. There was a scar along her left thumb from a bread knife that had slipped during her second winter here. Her dark hair was tied back with a piece of twine because the palace issued clips only to kitchen staff ranked 3rd tier and above, and Elira was 4th. She was pulling the first loaves from the lower oven when she heard the sound. It came from the alcove behind the dry stores, the narrow space between the flour sacks and the east wall where the old chimney ran and kept the stones warm even in deep winter. She had discovered it 3 years ago when she'd been sent to do inventory and found a small boy asleep behind the largest sack, curled around a wooden horse with his cheek pressed against the warm stone. The sound now was not crying. It was the controlled, almost inaudible breathing of someone working very hard not to cry. Elira pulled the second loaf from the oven, set it on the rack with both hands, and did not immediately go to the alcove. She'd learned that too. Rushing in made it worse. She moved through her next sequence of tasks at the same unhurried pace, wiped her hands on her apron, and then carried a small tin cup of warm broth toward the dry stores as if she needed something from the back shelf. Prince Kalis was sitting with his knees drawn to his chest, 7 years old, and wearing the kind of formal sleep clothes that said someone had dressed him for bed with more attention to appearance than comfort. His dark eyes tracked her from the moment she came around the flour sacks, wary and watchful, the way all children were when they'd learned that adults coming toward them usually meant something was about to be required of them. She sat down on the floor 3 feet away from him, set the broth between them, and said nothing. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. "The ceremony rehearsal is tomorrow," he said finally. His voice was flat, emptied out. "I know." "They moved my rooms." Elira looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the space between his knees, at some middle distance where he apparently kept the things he couldn't say out loud. "Moved them where?" "East wing, 3rd floor." He paused. "That's where storage is. Old storage." She understood what he wasn't saying. The east wing, 3rd floor, old storage meant away from the royal quarters, away from his father's rooms, away from everything that had once been his mother's. "They said it was because the south corridor needs repairs before the coronation guests arrive," he continued. "Lord Harwick told me. He said it was practical." "What do you think?" Kalis finally looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, because 7-year-olds who have lived in formal palaces learn early that anger costs more than it buys. It was the look of someone who already knew the truth and was deciding whether saying it out loud would make it more real. "I think Lady Seraphine asked them to move me," he said. "I think she wanted me further away." Elira didn't argue with him. She didn't offer him reassurances she didn't have. She pushed the tin cup a few inches closer to his knee. He picked it up and drank. The council chamber smelled like old ambition and new tension. Draven Kalor had been standing at the window for 11 minutes by the time his senior advisors stopped speaking. He knew because the clock on the eastern wall had chimed the quarter hour twice, and he had been counting without meaning to. It was the kind of thing the mind did when it was trying to avoid engaging with the thing directly in front of it. The thing directly in front of him was the coronation schedule. The formal presentation is set for the third morning after arrival, Lord Harwick was saying. He was 63, gray-bearded, and had served the Kaelor throne for longer than Draven had been alive, which meant he had a particular confidence in his own indispensability that occasionally needed managing. Lady Seraphine's household arrives 2 days prior. The temple ceremony itself is scheduled for sunset on the 7th day, per tradition. Which tradition? Draven's voice was flat. Harwick paused. Sire? Whose tradition? The sunset timing. That's not standard for a coronation ceremony. That was added. A brief silence. The other three advisors, Castellan Rowe, Treasury Minister Aldrich, and the head of protocol, a narrow-faced man named Crest, whom Draven had always found personally irritating, exchanged the particular variety of glance that men exchanged when they'd already discussed something and hoped the person they'd kept out of that discussion wouldn't notice. Draven noticed everything. He had always noticed everything. It was the particular burden of being the kind of person who couldn't stop watching. Lady Seraphine's household suggested the timing, Crest said carefully. It was felt that a sunset ceremony would present more favorably, visually, for the record makers and the formal portraiture. And you agreed. We felt there was no material objection. She isn't queen yet. Draven turned from the window. He wasn't a physically imposing man in the way that some alphas performed it. He didn't need the posturing, hadn't needed it in 15 years. His size was real, and his stillness was real, and the combination had a way of filling a room without effort. Decisions about the coronation ceremony are not made by the incoming household. They're made by me. If Lady Seraphine's people want to submit a preference, they can submit it to me in writing, and I'll decide whether it has merit. The silence this time had a different texture. Not the nervous quiet of before. This was the quiet of men recalibrating. Of course, sire, Harwick said. The timing will be restored to the standard midday ceremony. Good. Draven moved toward the table, looked down at the parchment spread across it without sitting. What else? The rest of the meeting was logistics. Supply arrangements, guest accommodations, security rotations. Draven processed it with the particular efficiency of a man who has run an empire long enough that administration has become a kind of physical reflex, the way breathing is, requiring only a fraction of conscious attention. The rest of his mind was somewhere else. It had been somewhere else for a while now. 3 years since Mira died. 3 years of ruling alone, which he had managed because there was no alternative to managing it. You picked up the weight, or you let the kingdom fall, and Draven was constitutionally incapable of letting anything fall. But the advisors had been right about one thing, even if he resented the way they'd said it. An empire needed a clear succession, and succession required a queen, and Draven had been king long enough to understand that the things a man needed and the things a man wanted were almost never the same list. Lady Seraphine Valdris was 26, beautiful in the precise way that meant she understood the strategic value of her own appearance, politically connected through 4 separate noble houses, and sharp enough that even Harwick, who respected women about as far as tradition required, had admitted she was an able negotiator. She was, by every rational measure, an appropriate choice. Draven had met her twice. Both times she'd said exactly the right things, in exactly the right order, with exactly the right amount of deference. He'd come away from both meetings with the faint, unsettling feeling of having been performed at rather than spoken to. He had not mentioned this to Harwick. "Anything further?" he said. "One minor matter," Rose said. "The prince's accommodations." Draven looked at him. "With the guest preparations, the south corridor is temporarily— Where is my son sleeping?" Rose shifted his weight. "East wing, 3rd floor. It's perfectly comfortable, of course." The East Wing 3rd floor is 40 meters from the nearest senior staff quarters and 2 floors above the nearest guard post. Draven's voice had not changed register, but something in it had, the way a river doesn't visibly change before a rapid. He's 7. The temporary nature of the arrangement: restore his rooms to the south corridor, move whatever storage is necessary elsewhere. Draven gathered the parchment from the table into a single stack and handed it to Crest without looking at him. "We're finished." He walked out. The south corridor was quiet at that hour, which was the hour after the council and before the midday meal, the gap in the day when the palace had a few minutes of holding its breath before the afternoon's obligations began. Draven walked it not because his chambers were at this end of the corridor, but because he had found, over years, that walking helped him think in a way that sitting never did. He was thinking about his son. Kalis had been a specific kind of child before Mira died, present in a way some children weren't, curious and occasionally exhausting in the good way of a person who wanted to understand how everything worked. He'd had opinions about which horses were worth riding and strong feelings about whether certain advisors were trustworthy, and he'd express both with the guileless confidence of a child who doesn't yet know that candor has a social cost. After Mira, that child had gone somewhere, and a different one had come back. Quieter. Contained in a way that didn't look like peace. It looked like fortification. Like something had pulled back behind a wall and was deciding, slowly, whether to trust the world again. Draven had tried. He was aware that he had tried inadequately, that the trying had been clumsy and infrequent, and sandwiched between the unrelenting demands of running a kingdom. He was aware of all of this the way you were aware of a wound in your side, constantly, with the particular exhausting clarity of something you couldn't fix by thinking about it harder. He passed the kitchens on the lower level, the warm air and smell of bread rising through the ventilation shaft. It was not a part of the palace he had reason to walk frequently. He wasn't sure what made him slow his pace. Then he heard it. Not words, just a voice, low and careful, and a second voice underneath it, small and with a quality that stopped him entirely. He had not heard his son's voice sound like that in 3 years. Draven stood at the corridor junction and did not move. The voices were coming from somewhere in the kitchen passage, close enough to carry but not loud enough to make out full sentences. He heard fragments. He heard his son's voice ask something, and the other voice answer in a way that was brief and direct, and apparently sufficient, because Kalis responded with a short, flat laugh that sounded almost involuntary, like something that had escaped before he could catch it. Draven stood there for a long moment. He did not go in. He was not sure why. Some instinct about the particular fragility of whatever was happening in that room, and the way an Alpha King's entrance would end it. He turned and walked back toward his chambers with the fragments of that laugh still sitting somewhere in his chest like a coal that hadn't finished burning. Seraphine Valdris arrived with 47 in her household and an organizational precision that made several of the senior palace staff privately resentful and publicly cooperative because she was not yet queen and this was not yet her palace, and resentment was a reasonable private response while cooperation remained the only viable public one. She was, as Draven had noted, beautiful. More striking in person than in the formal portraits, with the kind of bone structure that held its angles regardless of lighting and dark hair she wore pinned high in the style of Southern nobility. She greeted the senior staff with perfect warmth, names used correctly, small personal details referenced. And Draven watched her do it from the receiving hall doorway with the attention of a man reading a contract. "My king." She came to him last, which was a choice, and she made the formal bow with exactly the amount of depth that protocol required and not a fraction more, which was also a choice. "The Nightfang Palace is more magnificent than I was told. Lady Seraphine." He offered his hand and she took it. Her grip was firm, dry, controlled. "Your journey was comfortable?" "Entirely. Your roads are well maintained. I told my steward to note the bridge construction near the third pass. Whoever organized that work deserves recognition." She had, he noted, actually paid attention to his roads. Most visiting nobility looked at roads the way they looked at weather. Ambient conditions, irrelevant to the business at hand. "I'll pass it along," he said. She smiled. It was a good smile. Genuine warmth mixed in with the precision in a ratio he couldn't quite calculate. He was looking for the seam between the performance and the person and not finding it easily, which could mean there was very little seam, or it could mean she was simply better at hiding it than most. The reception moved through its formal stages. Harwick gave the welcoming address. Aldrich presented the guest ledger. Crest fussed over the order of presentations with the particularly tortured expression of a man whose life's purpose was the protection of protocol and who found every actual human being a threat to it. Prince Kalis stood to Draven's left throughout, dressed in the formal clothes the chamberlain had prepared, very still and very straight in the way he got when he was performing the role rather than occupying it. He had been told to welcome Lady Seraphine. He had been told what to say. Draven had reviewed the prepared remarks himself, had cut the two sentences that sounded least like a 7-year-old and added nothing, because adding things to what your son was supposed to say was a different kind of failure. When Seraphine came to him, she crouched slightly, bringing herself to eye level. Some adults did this badly, with the studied condescension of someone performing engagement without feeling it. Seraphine did it smoothly. "Prince Kalis," she said, "I've heard a great deal about you." Kalis looked at her. His face was the controlled mask. "My lady, I understand you're interested in horses." "Yes. I have a gray in my stable that I'm told is extraordinary. Perhaps when things are less hectic, you'll come see her." A pause. Something moved behind Kalis's eyes, interest or wariness or some combination that lived in the same neighborhood. "Maybe," he said. It was not the prepared welcome remarks. It was also, Draven noticed, the most Kalis had said to a new person in months. He stored this information in the same place he kept all the information about his son, the running archive of a parent who was watching more than he was certain he understood. The reception ended. The household was shown to their quarters. Seraphine departed with the gracious efficiency of someone who knew when to exit a scene, and Draven watched her go with the particular tiredness that came not from the body, but from the sustained effort of paying very close attention. 4 days before the ceremony, Draven found one of Seraphine's senior women, a household manager named Vey, speaking to his head steward near the door of the south corridor. He was not close enough to hear the words. He was close enough to see the steward's expression, which was the expression of a man receiving an instruction he didn't like, and was going to follow anyway because the power differential made objection expensive. He would have kept walking. It was entirely possible there were 100 mundane explanations for whatever they were discussing, and a king who interrogated every administrative conversation in his palace before hearing it out would be an exhausted and paranoid king within a fortnight. But then the steward looked up, saw Draven, and the expression on his face changed in a way that told him the conversation had been about something the steward didn't want him to see. Draven changed direction. Vey turned, recovered quickly, gave the appropriate bow. She was perhaps 40, compact and controlled in the way of people who had spent their careers managing large households and had learned that emotional visibility was a liability. "My king," she said, "I was just coordinating with your steward regarding the... What were you discussing?" The pause was very brief. "The final guest accommodations. There are some details around seating arrangements for the coronation feast that Lady Seraphine wanted confirmed." He looked at the steward, who was looking at the floor with the studied concentration of a man who wanted to be anywhere else. "Is that right?" Draven said. "Yes, sire." He looked at Vey for another moment. She met his gaze steadily, and he gave her credit for that. Most people found sustaining eye contact with him difficult when things had gone sideways, but she held it without blinking, which meant either she was genuinely innocent or she was very, very good. "My steward will inform me if there are feast arrangements that require my input," Draven said. "I appreciate the coordination." He continued down the corridor. That evening, he sent for the steward privately. The man came in looking like someone walking toward a sentencing. He was 40 years of palace service, competent and loyal in the unremarkable way of people who did their work without drama, which was, in fact, the highest category of palace staff. "Tell me what she actually asked you," Draven said. The steward was quiet for a moment. Then, in the flat tone of a man choosing honesty over comfort, "She asked about the prince's current room assignment, whether the East Wing accommodation was permanent or temporary." Draven was still. "I told her it was temporary, that you'd ordered his rooms restored." The steward paused. "She asked who had given the order to restore them." "And you told her?" "I did. Sire, I'm sorry. She framed it as a logistical question, and I didn't think..." "It's all right." Draven's voice was even. "Is there anything else she asked about?" "She asked about the prince's daily schedule, where he spent his time, specifically." The steward hesitated. "She asked whether the kitchen staff had any unauthorized interactions with the royal household." The coal in Draven's chest was back, only colder now. "Unauthorized interactions," he repeated. "Those were her words, sire. But He went to the kitchens the next morning, not for a particular reason, not with evidence or accusation or any formal purpose. He went because he was a man who dealt with things directly when he could, and because his son's laugh, the real one, the involuntary one, had been sitting somewhere in his memory for 4 days and he could not work out why. The kitchen staff greeted him with the terrified efficiency of people who had never had the king appear at their workstation before dawn. He asked a few ordinary questions about supplies and the coronation feast preparations, got the answers with excessive amounts of gratitude, and was preparing to leave when he saw her. She was on the far side of the kitchen, carrying a tray from the lower ovens, and she didn't see him immediately. She was navigating around another worker and watching the tray, and her attention was on the task. She was young, dark-haired, fourth tier by the designation on her apron. She moved with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who had been in this room long enough that the room was just extension of herself. She reached the rack, set the tray down with both hands, and then looked up and saw him. She went still the way a bird went still, the absolute motionlessness of something that has been spotted and is calculating. Draven crossed the kitchen toward her. The other workers in the vicinity managed to find reasons to be anywhere else with remarkable speed. "You're Elira Vale," he said. He'd had the name from the steward this morning, not as part of any interrogation, just as a name attached to a description. "Yes, sire." Her voice was steady. She was looking at a point just below his chin, the appropriate line of sight for a fourth-tier Omega staff member addressing the king, which meant she was following protocol and not looking directly at him. And he could not read her face. "My son comes here," he said. It was not a question, a breath. "Yes." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment that was not hesitation. It was the moment of someone deciding what level of honesty the situation required and whether the risk of it was worth taking. "Because he started coming here on his own," she said, "about 2.5 years ago. He found the warm alcove behind the dry stores and slept there one afternoon. I didn't report it because," she paused, "because he was sleeping. I didn't think waking him and sending him back upstairs was the right thing. And after that, he kept coming back. Not every day. Some weeks not at all." Her hands were at her sides, still, the tray between them on the rack. "He sits in the alcove and I bring him something warm and we talk sometimes. Or we don't talk. Sometimes he just wants to be somewhere quiet." "What do you talk about?" "Whatever he wants to talk about." She paused. "Horses, mostly. The construction on the North Road. He watches it from his window and he has very specific opinions about the paving, whether certain advisors can be trusted." A very brief pause. "His mother, sometimes." Something in Draven's chest pulled tight and did not release. "He talks to you about his mother." "Not often, and I don't guide it. He brings her up when he needs to." She finally looked up, just briefly, 1 second of eye contact before returning to the middle distance. "I don't have the right to make decisions about what the prince should or shouldn't discuss. I only know that when he leaves the kitchen, he looks more like himself than when he arrives." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere at the far end, a pot was simmering, and that was the only sound. Draven looked at this woman, this fourth-tier Omega servant with the calloused hands and the flower on her apron and the piece of twine holding back her hair, and felt something he hadn't felt in this palace in a long time. Something complicated and not fully nameable. The sensation of standing in a room and discovering that a wall you'd thought was solid was in fact a door. "How long have you been in this palace?" he said. 7 years, sire." 7 years and I've never seen you. I'm very good at not being seen." She said it without any particular tone. Not self-deprecation, not pride. Just a plain statement about a skill. He stood there for a moment longer than the conversation required. "The coronation feast," he said finally. "The kitchen will be stretched. If you need additional staff, speak to the head cook and tell him I authorized it." She blinked. "Sire? You're managing the pastry prep?" Yes, sire." "Then make sure you have enough hands." He turned toward the kitchen entrance. "Don't let my son go without sleep before the ceremony. He performs badly on no sleep, and he'll be visible in the temple." He did not wait for her response. He walked back through the corridor with the particular precision of a man who was trying very hard to think about something other than what he was actually thinking about, which was 7 years, and not once had any advisor, any chamberlain, any senior staff member with access to daily palace reports mentioned a fourth-tier kitchen servant who had apparently been the one person in this entire building capable of reaching his son. Elira went through the rest of the morning with her hands working and her mind somewhere that was not the kitchen. She had been spoken to by the king. This was not a category of event she had a framework for. It lived outside the boundaries of what was supposed to happen to a fourth-tier Omega in a palace kitchen, the way certain weather events lived outside the boundaries of what a given structure was built to withstand. She pressed the dough and pulled the loaves and sorted the stores and told herself firmly to stop thinking about it. She was still telling herself to stop thinking about it when Lena appeared at her elbow. Lena, who was second-tier bakery staff and had been in the kitchen since before Elira's arrival and had the particular knowledge of palace dynamics that came from years of watching everything from a vantage point nobody paid attention to. "What did he want?" Lena said, in the flat voice of someone who had watched the king walk through the kitchen and needed to understand what that meant. "Nothing. Asked about the coronation feast prep." Lena looked at her. "He asked if I needed more staff," Elira said. "The king asked the fourth-tier pastry worker if she needed staff. He was asking about the coronation feast in general. He walked past 6 people to stand at your station." Elira didn't answer. She pulled a tray and moved toward the ovens and felt Lena watching her back. Later, near midday, she was in the dry store's alcove taking inventory when she heard voices from the corridor outside the kitchen's east entrance. She was not trying to hear them. The east entrance corridor had a particular acoustic quality. The stone walls ran parallel for about 8 meters, and the sound traveled with unnatural clarity toward the back of the stores. It was Vay's voice, one of Lady Seraphine's household managers she'd heard, the one who'd been consulting with the head steward 2 days ago. "The child is a complication," Vay was saying. "Lady Seraphine has been patient, but the boy's attachment to the south corridor needs to be addressed properly, not through temporary measures. Once she is queen, the east wing arrangement should be made permanent. Distance from the royal quarters will normalize over time." A second voice, lower, careful. "There's also the question of the interactions, the kitchen staff." Yes. Vay's voice was precise and cold in the particular way of someone who viewed other human beings as logistical problems. "After the coronation, there will be a review of below-stairs staff with access to the royal household. Lady Seraphine wants any informal arrangements ended cleanly." "And the girl specifically?" A pause. "Reassigned," Vay said, "far enough that it's not an issue." Elira stood in the dry store's alcove with her inventory list held loosely in her hands, and the flour dust settling around her, and did not move for a long time. She was not afraid for herself. Or she was, but it was the lower register fear, the dull hum of it that had been background noise for most of her life in service. The awareness of her own replaceability, her own disposability, the fact that she existed in this palace at the pleasure of people who had never learned her name. What she was feeling now was different, sharper, located somewhere specific in her chest. Kalis. She thought about his face when he arrived at the alcove, the fortified look, the controlled stillness, the 7-year-old version of a man who had learned to brace himself. She thought about the way he looked after an hour in the kitchen, the fractional loosening around the eyes, the involuntary laugh when something was genuinely funny, the way he talked about his mother in the low, careful voice of someone handling something that could break. She thought about him in the east wing, 3rd floor, with the old storage smell and the 40 meters to the nearest staff quarters, 2 floors above the nearest guard. She thought about what permanent meant. The inventory list was still in her hands. She looked at it without reading it. There was nothing she could do. She was a 4th-tier Omega servant with 7 years in a kitchen and no standing to act on anything she'd overheard, no mechanism for reaching the people who had the power to change what was being planned, no claim on any outcome in this palace. She was very good at not being seen, and the best thing she could do, the only practical thing, was to keep being very good at it. She went back to the inventory. She got through half the list before she stopped, stood in the warm alcove with the flour sacks at her back, and stared at the east wall where the old chimney ran. Kalis had found this alcove himself 3 years ago. He'd found it because he'd needed somewhere warm and quiet, somewhere that wasn't his mother's empty rooms or his father's occupied ones, or the formal spaces that kept requiring him to perform grief correctly. He'd found it himself because no one else had thought to find it for him. Elira carefully finished the inventory, wrote the complete list in the record ledger, and set her flour-dusted apron on the hook by the door. She walked to the upper corridor, to the section she had never had reason to walk, and stood for a long moment outside the door of the office, where the king's personal steward kept his schedule. She stood there long enough that it became a choice rather than an accident. She knocked. The steward looked up from behind his desk with the expression of a man who had not expected to see a fourth-tier kitchen worker standing in his doorway and was currently deciding what that meant for the afternoon. "I need to speak to the king," Elira said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "That is not," he started. "I know what it is and isn't." She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you I need to speak to him. About his son. And about something I overheard today that I don't think he knows." The steward looked at her for a long moment. He was the same man who had been in the corridor with Vey, she realized. The same man who had later told the king what was asked of him. She watched something cross his face that might have been calculation or might have been conscience. "Wait here," he said. She waited. The clock in the corridor ticked through 11 minutes. The steward came back, and his expression had shifted in a way she couldn't read. He opened the door wider and stood aside. "He'll see you," he said. "Don't waste his time." Elira walked through the door. At the end of the corridor, visible through the open office entrance, Draven Kalor stood with his back to the window and his arms crossed, watching her approach with the absolute stillness of a man who had already started deciding what she was going to tell him. She walked toward him with the flowers still on her hands, and the piece of twine in her hair, and the full weight of what she was about to do sitting somewhere in her sternum like a stone she'd swallowed. She had 7 years of perfect invisibility behind her. She had maybe 30 seconds of the king's attention ahead of her. She had absolutely no idea what happened to an Omega servant who walked into the king's office and told him his betrothed was planning to dismantle the one good thing in his son's life. She was going to find out. The office was smaller than she'd expected. That was the first thing Elira registered. Not the king, not the weight of the room, but the scale of it. She had imagined the king's private office the way you imagine places you'd never been allowed to enter, which was to say she'd made it larger in her head, more formal, colder. In reality, it was a working room. Maps on the walls with notations in the margins, a desk with stacked correspondence and a pen left uncapped, a window that faced the inner courtyard and let in the sound of the stable yard below. Draven was standing beside the desk, not behind it. That was also not what she'd expected. He was watching her cross the room with the full attention of a man who did not divide his focus. And the full attention of this particular man was, she was realizing, a specific physical experience, not threatening in the obvious way. More like standing in front of something very large that was very still. She stopped at the appropriate distance. The stone floor was cold through the thin soles of her work shoes. "Shut the door," he said. She turned, shut it, turned back. "The steward said you have something about my son." No preamble, no social padding. She found unexpectedly that she preferred it. "Yes," she said. "Then say it." She said it. All of it. Vey's voice in the corridor, the words she'd chosen, the specific phrase about making the East Wing arrangement permanent, the conversation about reviewing below-stairs staff, the word reassigned, and the cold precision with which it had been delivered. She said it in order, without editorializing, in the flat, careful tone she used for inventory reports. It took perhaps 2 minutes. When she finished, the office was very quiet. Draven was still standing in the same position. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed his expression in any way she could read. The only thing that had shifted was something around his eyes, a tightening, fractional, and brief, that vanished before she could be certain she'd seen it. "Where were you when you heard this?" he said. "The dry store's alcove. East entrance corridor has an acoustic run. The walls carry sound from the door junction about 8 meters in." "You're certain it was Vey?" "I've heard her voice twice in 4 days." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "And you're certain about the word?" "Reassigned." "I wrote it down before I came up here." She pulled the small folded square from her apron pocket. The back of the inventory page, the one she'd torn off and written on with the stub of pencils she kept for stock notations. She crossed the remaining distance to the desk and set it down. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at her. "You wrote it down," he said. "In case I was questioned about what I actually heard versus what I thought I heard. I didn't want the distinction to matter." Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. He picked up the paper, read it, set it back down on the desk with the same care she'd used to set down the tin cup in the alcove 3 weeks ago, in a different world entirely. "Why are you here?" he said. She blinked. "Sire? Your fourth-tier kitchen staff. What you overheard was a conversation between senior household management. There's no version of this where coming to me was the safe choice." He was watching her with the directness of a man who had spent decades reading people and was currently doing it. "So I want to know why you came." The honest answer was sitting right at the surface, which was unusual. She was not, generally, someone who kept honest answers available for quick retrieval. She thought about dressing it up, routing it through the appropriate deference, making it sound more pragmatic and less personal. She decided not to, because if I didn't say something and it happened, I'd have known it was coming and done nothing. She held his gaze for precisely as long as she could before looking back toward the middle distance. He doesn't have many places that are safe. Losing the kitchen wouldn't just be losing the kitchen. It would be him losing the thing that was making him trust that some places could be safe. She paused. "I know that's not—" "Stop qualifying it," he said. She stopped. "You came because you didn't want my son to get hurt," he said. "That's sufficient. You don't need to argue it into something more defensible." The directness of that landed somewhere unexpected, and she had to take a moment with it. "Yes," she said, "that's why." He nodded once, with the spare economy of a man who stored information and moved on. "You'll go back to the kitchen," he said. "You'll behave exactly as you normally do. You will not indicate to anyone that you heard anything or came here. Can you do that?" "I've been not indicating things for 7 years. The corner of his mouth shifted. It wasn't a smile, it was the forerunner of one, the place a smile would be if it got the invitation. "Go," he said. She went. She made it back to the kitchen before the midday preparation rush, retied her apron, and started in on the afternoon dough without speaking to anyone. Lena glanced at her from across the room and said nothing, which was the specific mercy of a woman who understood that sometimes a person needed to work without being watched. Elira pressed the dough and did not think about the king's office. She did not think about the way the afternoon light had come through his window. She did not think about the slight shift at the corner of his mouth. She did not think about the fact that he had said her words back to her. You don't need to argue it into something more defensible, with the ease of someone who had been thinking the same thing before she said it. She pressed the dough harder. Bus. Seraphine noticed the prince at dinner. Not the first dinner, the formal one, the night of arrival, which had been about establishing the shape of things. The second dinner, 3 days before the ceremony, smaller and less ceremonial, the kind of meal that was actually a meeting with food attached. Kalis was seated 2 chairs down from his father on the right side, which was protocol, and he ate with the careful attention to table manners that the chamberlain had apparently spent the last week reinforcing. He didn't speak unless spoken to, which was also protocol, and he didn't drop anything, and his back was straight the whole time in the exhausted way of a child maintaining a posture because someone was watching. Seraphine watched him between courses with the unobtrusive attention she applied to everything, the absorption of information that looked like social pleasantness from the outside. "Prince Kalis," she said during the third course, in the warm conversational tone she used with children and subordinates and people she wanted to believe she was being warmed to. "Have you decided about the gray mare? I've asked my groom to make sure she's available for viewing." Kalis looked up from his plate. He looked at her, and in the 2 seconds before he answered, something happened in his face that Draven, watching from his end of the table, catalogued with the automatic precision of a parent who had been reading his child's face for 7 years. It was not hostility. It was not rudeness. It was the particular look of a person who has been extended an offer and is trying to figure out what the offer actually costs. "Maybe after the ceremony," Kalis said. Perfectly polite. Perfectly managed. "Thank you, my lady." Seraphine smiled and turned to say something to Harwick, and the conversation moved on, and Kalis returned to his plate. Draven cut his meat and ate it and said nothing. After the meal, in the corridor outside the dining hall, Seraphine came to walk beside him in the easy manner of a woman who understood that proximity to power required making proximity feel natural. "He's a careful boy," she said. "He is." Understandable, given everything. A pause. "I want him to be comfortable. I hope he understands that." Draven looked at her. She was looking ahead at the corridor, her expression open and earnest, which it usually was, and he had been in the company of people who could maintain an earnest expression through almost anything for long enough to know that the expression itself was not the information. "He'll come around," Draven said. "He needs time." "Of course." She touched his arm briefly, the lightest contact, the kind that acknowledged familiarity without demanding it. "I'm not rushing anything." He matched her pace for the remainder of the corridor and said nothing further, and let her take her departure at the hall junction with all the grace she consistently brought to it. He stood at the junction for a moment after she was gone. She had not said anything wrong. There was not a single sentence he could point to and call a lie. She was, by all surface evidence, making a genuine effort toward a child who was being difficult, and she was being patient about it, and this was exactly the behavior a reasonable man would hope to see. He was aware that he was looking for the seam. He was aware that Elira's words, it would be him losing the thing that was making him trust that some places could be safe, were not neutral information, that they had changed the angle from which he was seeing things, and that it was possible he was now finding fault where there was none. He was also aware that the instinct telling him to keep watching was the same instinct that had kept him alive for 20 years of ruling an empire where everyone around him had something to gain from his trust, and that instinct had not failed him yet. He kept walking. Thoughts. He found Vey the next morning. He had thought about how to approach it, whether to come at it sideways, let her think it was about something else until the ground was already shifted, the way he'd handled a dozen council confrontations where he needed someone off balance before they could prepare. It was an effective method. He decided against it. He didn't have time for effective methods. The ceremony was in 3 days. She was in the east corridor near the preparation rooms with a ledger and the brisk efficiency of someone midway through a task. He came at her directly. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request, and she knew it wasn't. She fell into step beside him with the controlled composure of a woman who had been in service to powerful people long enough that surprises did not show on her face. He walked for 30 seconds without speaking. In his experience, silence was the fastest way to make people uncomfortable enough to talk, and he wanted to see where she went before he went anywhere. She went nowhere. She matched his pace and said nothing and kept her eyes forward. He gave her credit for that. Then he said, "Tell me what Lady Seraphine asked you to look into regarding my son's accommodation." The step she took after he said it was slightly shorter than the ones before it, a half-inch, barely perceptible. "I'm not sure I know what you mean, Sire Day. I mean the conversation you had in the east entrance corridor 2 days ago." He kept his voice level, which was not difficult. He'd had a long time to practice keeping his voice level. The one about making the East Wing arrangement permanent and reviewing below-stairs staff. She was quiet for 5 steps. The corridor passed on either side of them. "Lady Seraphine is preparing to take on management of the household," Vey said carefully. "It's natural that she would want to understand current arrangements and consider what might be adjusted after the coronation." "Adjusted," he said. "Refined." The word you used was reassigned. Another pause, different in texture from the first. This one had a decision in it. "There are below-stairs staff who have developed informal relationships with members of the royal household," she said. Lady Seraphine felt that those relationships, while perhaps well-intentioned, might complicate a healthy transition. It's a reasonable concern for an incoming queen to... Lady Seraphine is not queen yet. The corridor was very still. "No," Vey said, "she is not. Decisions about this household, its staff, and my son's accommodations are made by me." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she stopped and faced him. And to her credit, she was still maintaining the composure, still meeting his gaze, but her hands had tightened on the ledger. "When Lady Seraphine becomes queen, we will have a conversation about how household management will function and what authority she holds over what decisions. That conversation will happen with me, directly, and I will tell her what is and isn't within her scope, not the other way around. Of course, sire. If you have concerns about staff interactions you believe are inappropriate, you bring them to my steward, not to each other in a back corridor." "Understood." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he said in the same flat tone, "You're good at your work. I don't want to lose you from the household if it can be avoided. But I need you to understand clearly that your loyalty in this palace runs to the king first, not to the incoming household, not to Lady Seraphine. Something shifted in Vei's face. Barely, but it shifted. "Yes, sire," she said. He left her in the corridor. He walked back toward the main hall and felt the particular tight tension in his chest that came not from anger. Anger was simple. Anger was just fuel. But from the thing underneath anger. The thing that was starting to sound uncomfortably like a question he didn't want to be asking about the woman he had agreed to make his queen. He told none of this to Harwick. He did not call an emergency council. He did not summon Seraphine. He made no formal move of any kind. 3 days before a coronation was not the time to pull a thread, because pulling threads 3 days before a coronation would unravel something. The ceremony, the alliance, the 20 political agreements that had been built on the understanding that this marriage was happening. You did not pull a thread 3 days before. You marked where it was, and you watched, and you waited. He had done this before. He was good at it. What he had not done before, what was new, what was the thing he could not quite place, was the awareness that the one person in this palace who had handed him the thread was a woman with flour on her hands and a piece of twine in her hair who had come to his office and delivered information that cost her everything and asked for nothing. He had asked her why she came, and she had told him the truth without softening it, and then she had looked at him with the particular steady gaze of someone who was not asking to be believed or reassured or thanked. He was thinking about that look. He needed to stop thinking about that look. The morning of the second to last day before the ceremony, Kalis appeared in the kitchen. Elira was at the North Station, deep in pastry prep, when she heard the alcove door, the small scraping sound of flour sacks shifting that she'd learned years ago to register as a specific signal. She finished the fold she was on, covered the tray, and crossed to the dry stores. Kalis was sitting in the alcove with his knees up and his formal jacket unbuttoned at the collar, which meant he'd left his rooms without the chamberlain's knowledge. He was holding the wooden horse, the same one he'd had 3 years ago, a little more worn now at the mane. She sat down across from him without a word. He didn't speak for a while. She waited. "She came to my rooms," he said finally, "Lady Seraphine. Yesterday. She brought a gift, a book about horses." He was looking at the wooden one in his hands, turning it. "She sat with me for an hour and asked me questions about my favorite routes in the Eastern Pass and whether I preferred morning or afternoon rides and what I thought about the new stable additions. What did you think about the conversation?" He was quiet for a moment. "She was trying," he said. "I could tell she was trying. She was being nice." He said the word with the precision of a child for whom the word was insufficient for something complex. But it felt like she was reading from a list, like she'd asked someone what questions to ask me and then asked them. Elira looked at him. "Is that unkind?" he said. "To notice that?" "No," she said. "That's just accurate." He looked up from the horse. "Do you think she's bad?" The question landed in her chest with more weight than it should have. She thought about the corridor conversation, the word reassigned, the cold precision of it. She thought about the king's face in the office. She thought about the particular responsibility of being the person a 7-year-old asked for honest answers. "I think she wants things," Elira said, carefully. "I think she's not used to anything standing between her and the things she wants. Whether that makes her bad..." She paused. "I don't know yet." Kalis absorbed this in the way he absorbed most things, fully, without rushing to a response. "She makes my father different," he said. "Different how?" "He watches her." He looked down at the horse again. "He watches everybody, my father. That's just how he is. But when he watches her, it's a different kind of watching, like he's waiting for something." He frowned, small and private, the expression of someone feeling their way through language that wasn't quite large enough for what they were trying to say. "He used to watch my mother the other way, the not waiting way." Elira sat with that. "I miss her," Kalis said. It was flat and simple and absolute. "I miss her all the time, but it's like it gets heavier right now because everything is changing and she's not here and..." He stopped, set the wooden horse down on the stone floor between them. "I don't know how to say it right." "You don't have to say it right," Elira said. "You just said it." He looked at her. In the warm alcove light, with the chimney stones at his back and the flower smell and the distant kitchen sounds, he looked exactly like what he was. A child carrying something too heavy and trying to carry it with dignity. and the fierceness that moved through Elira in that moment was something she didn't have a clean name for. "Elira," he said. "Yes. Will you still be here? After?" He asked it with the particular neutrality of someone who already suspects the answer and is managing their relationship with hope. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the king's office. She thought about go back to the kitchen and behave exactly as you normally do. She thought about, I need you to understand clearly that your loyalty runs to the king first. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know what had been done with the information she'd given, what protection it offered, whether the king's intervention with Vey was visible or invisible or sufficient. She didn't know anything except that this child was looking at her and asking a question she would not lie about. "I'm going to try," she said. It was not a promise. He heard it as one anyway. She could see it in the small shift around his eyes, and she let him hear it that way because it was the truest thing she had to give him. He picked up the wooden horse, turned it once in his hands, set it on the flour sack beside him and left it there. "I'm going to go back before Wren wakes up," he said, meaning his chamberlain, and stood, and buttoned his jacket collar back up with the careful attention of someone undoing the evidence of a small rebellion. She watched him go. She sat in the alcove for a long time after he was gone, her back against the warm stone, her hands resting in her lap with the faint dusting of flour already beginning to cool on her knuckles. Tomorrow was the last day before the ceremony. The day after that, Seraphine Valdris would stand in the temple and have the moon crown placed on her head. And whatever Draven had or had not done with what Elira had told him would either matter or it wouldn't. And Elira would either still be in this kitchen come nightfall, or she would be packing her few things into a bag and walking to wherever the reassignment took her. She was not afraid. That surprised her a little. The absence of fear. She'd expected fear. What was there instead was something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a person who has made a choice that cannot be unmade and has decided to stand inside it rather than run from it. She stood up, went back to the pastry station. She was halfway through the afternoon's work when the kitchen door opened and Draven Kalor walked in for the second time in a week. Only this time, he was not alone. Seraphine was 2 steps behind him. Her dark eyes swept the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone cataloging a room they intend to know, and they moved across the stations, the staff, the shelves, and they stopped. They stopped on Elira. Not long. 1 second, maybe 2. The length of time it takes to recognize a thing and file it. But Elira felt it like a hand on the back of her neck. Seraphine knew. She didn't know how. She didn't know who had said what or where the information had come from, whether it was Vey or the steward or some other current in the palace that Elira hadn't seen. But the look on Seraphine's face in that 2-second window, not angry, not threatened, simply precise and cold and absolutely certain, told Elira with complete clarity that the woman who was going to be queen tomorrow had already identified her, had already decided what to do about her, and had already set something in motion that an apron and a piece of twine were not going to stop. Draven had noticed where Seraphine's eyes had gone. Elira could see it in the set of his shoulders. He hadn't turned toward her. He was giving nothing away. He was standing in the center of the kitchen doing exactly what kings did, which was reveal only what they chose to reveal and hold everything else perfectly still. He was holding a great deal still. Seraphine looked away from Elira and said something to the head cook about the coronation feast, and her voice was warm and her manner was gracious, and none of it was an accident. And somewhere in the palace, the ceremony was 1 day away, and the moon crown was in its case, and a 7-year-old boy had left a wooden horse in an alcove like a thing he trusted he could come back to. And Elira Vale stood at her station with the pastry dough under her hands and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has nothing left to lose, that the choice she'd already made was about to demand everything. The kitchen went back to work. That was the thing about palaces. They were very good at resuming. Someone dropped a lid and picked it up. Someone else carried a pot to the far counter. The head cook began answering Seraphine's questions about the feast preparations with the careful deference of a man who understood that the person asking him questions today would be signing his employment papers by this time tomorrow. And Draven stood 2 steps behind her and said nothing, and the kitchen moved around them like a river moving around 2 stones. Elira pressed dough. She pressed it and folded it and pressed it again and did not look up and did not look at the door and did not think about anything except the immediate sequence of her hands, because her hands were the only thing she had reliable control over right now, and she was going to use them. she felt when they left. Not because she heard the door. She heard it, but the feeling came before the sound. The particular shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when something dangerous moves out of a room. Lena appeared at her elbow 30 seconds later. "Don't," Illyra said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "Good." Lena was quiet for a moment, then, because she was Lena, she looked at you for 2 seconds longer than she looked at anybody else. "I know. That's not nothing." I know that too." Illyra turned the dough, pressed the heel of her palm into it. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to get back to the bread?" Lena went back to the bread. The afternoon passed. The kitchen produced what the kitchen needed to produce for the pre-ceremony dinner, and Illyra managed the pastry station through to the end of the shift and cleaned her workspace with the same care she always brought to it, which was the kind of care that comes from understanding that someone else would be using the surface tomorrow, and that tomorrow's problems belong to tomorrow's person. She was pulling the strings on her apron when the steward appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He crossed the room, which he had never once done in 7 years. Stewards communicated through the head cook, not directly with fourth-tier staff, and the fact that he was covering the distance himself told her something before he opened his mouth. "The king wants you, now." The office again. The same light, later in the afternoon, the shadow angles shifted, the map walls and the uncapped pen. This time, Draven was behind the desk, which was different. He was standing behind it with both hands resting on the surface, fingers spread, looking at something, a piece of parchment, that he turned face down when she came in. He waited until she'd closed the door. "Seraphine's household submitted a formal request this morning," he said. His voice was level. It was the kind of level that required maintenance. "Before she walked through the kitchen with me, before I was aware it had been submitted." Illyra waited. The request documented a concern regarding a below-stairs staff member who had allegedly developed an inappropriate attachment to the prince, was providing him unauthorized access to restricted areas of the palace, and had been observed using her position to— the language they used was cultivate dependency. He said those 2 words with a particular flatness that made them worse, not better. The request asked that the staff member be removed from palace service entirely, not reassigned. Removed. The floor was still cold through the soles of her shoes. The request, he continued, included 3 signed witness statements. "Who signed them?" He was quiet for a beat. "Ren, the chamberlain." She absorbed that. Ren had been Kaelus's chamberlain for 2 years. She had seen him in the corridor outside the kitchen twice that she'd noticed. She had nodded to him, and he had nodded back, and that was the full extent of their relationship. She had no memory of ever doing anything that could be called— she pressed on the word— cultivate, anything that could constitute cultivation. "He also signed a statement from 2 secondary household witnesses," Draven said, "both from Seraphine's entourage. They were never in the kitchen," Illyra said. "I've never seen either of them below the 2nd floor." "I know." He turned the parchment over and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man confronting something he had seen before in a different shape, and was not surprised by, but was still, in some specific way, not finished being angry about. Ren's statement on its own creates a problem. She looked at him. He's been with Kaelus for 2 years. His account of interactions carries weight, and his statement says— He stopped, and this was the first time he'd stopped, the first crack in the level voice. His statement says that the prince has mentioned Illyra Vale by name on multiple occasions as someone he prefers to spend time with over the staff assigned to his care, that he has left his rooms at night to seek her out, that the nature of the relationship exceeds appropriate servant-to-household member boundaries. Each thing Ren's statement said was technically true. That was what made it devastating. Each specific fact was a fact. Kaelus had gone to the kitchen, he had gone at night. He had said her name, and his preference was real and visible. The witness had taken every true thing and arranged it into a shape that meant something different, something that looked, if you were not in the alcove, if you did not know the warmth of the stones, or the tin cup of broth, or the way the boy breathed when he was finally not performing, looked exactly like what Seraphine needed it to look like. She had underestimated how thoroughly she'd been watched. "Did you know Ren would do this?" Draven asked. Not accusatory. Genuine. "No." She said it without hesitation. I never spoke to him directly except in passing. I don't know why he... I do. Draven moved from behind the desk, and the movement had energy in it, the coiled kind. He was offered the senior chamberlain position for after the coronation. Harwick confirmed it this afternoon. The offer came from Seraphine's household 3 weeks ago. He stopped at the window, put his back to it. A promotion like that doesn't come without expectations of loyalty. The shape of it assembled itself in her mind, and she sat with it, and the sitting was not gentle. He's been reporting to them, she said. Everything he saw. Yes. Draven's jaw was set. And what he saw was enough because what actually happened was enough. The facts are real. Only what they're being made to mean is the lie. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which she found strange. She would have expected silence with the king to feel like pressure, the way most powerful spaces did. This one felt like two people standing on the same side of something and looking at it. What happens now, she said. Now is where it gets complicated. He crossed to the desk and sat, which was also different. He hadn't sat during either of their previous conversations. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who was tired, not in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense, the kind of tired that collects in the space behind the sternum. If I dismiss the request outright, I look like I'm protecting a servant over an incoming queen. Before the ceremony, with half the empire's nobility in residence. He picked up the pen from the desk, looked at it. If I act on it, I remove the one person in this palace my son trusts. She looked at him. You understand the position, he said. It was not a question. I've been in service long enough, she said carefully, to understand that the position is not actually about me. He looked up from the pen. The position, she said, is about whether Lady Seraphine can use her household's resources to remove obstacles before she's even queen. If that works once, it works again. Next time the obstacle will be something larger than a kitchen servant. He was very still. That's the thread, she said, isn't it? He set the pen down, looked at her for a long moment with an expression she still could not fully read. She had been reading people her whole life out of necessity, and this man had depths she couldn't sound in 2 conversations. But the surface of the expression was something she recognized from the alcove sometimes, when Kalis was working through something larger than his current vocabulary. The look of a person who has just had a thing named that they already knew but had not yet said out loud. Yes, he said. That's the thread. Then you know what you have to do with it. I do. His voice had gone back to level, but it was a different level now, not maintained, genuine. What I don't know is how to protect you in the meantime. The word protect landed unexpectedly. Not the concept. The concept was a king calculating an asset's value that was just governance. The word specifically, the directness of it, the way he'd used it without padding or qualification. She kept her expression still, and her voice practical, and told herself to stay in the useful register of this conversation and not in the other one. I'm difficult to reassign if I'm actively essential to the coronation feast preparation, she said. The feast is in 2 days. If someone formally objected to removing me now, the disruption could be cited as cause to delay the request until after the ceremony. He looked at her with the same look he'd given her in the kitchen that first morning, the look of a man encountering something he hadn't expected. You've been thinking about this, he said. I think about most things before I say them. A pause, then, plainly, is that how you survived 7 years invisible? 7 years invisible, she said, and 1 very visible week. The corner of his mouth shifted again. This time it completed the journey. You're formally essential to the coronation feast preparation, he said. I'll have it documented. Thank you, sire. Go. Chat. She made it back to the kitchen. She remade the pastry she'd abandoned, worked through the prep for the following morning, and left the kitchen at the normal hour with the normal amount of flour on her apron and the normal pace of someone going to eat and rest. She did not eat. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the 4th-tier dormitory and looked at the wall and let herself feel, for the first time that day, the full weight of what had been done. Ren had watched Kalis for 2 years, had seen him leave his rooms, had seen him come back different, quieter in the good way, more present, less fortified. Had watched the only real comfort the boy had in this palace and had taken a salary and turned it into testimony. She did not spend long on the anger. It was there, and it was real. And it had the particular quality of something that burns clean because it's righteous. But anger wasn't useful right now, and she was, above everything else, a practical person. What she sat with longer was the fear she hadn't admitted to the king. Not fear for herself, though that was present too, a low practical hum. Fear for what happened after the ceremony. Because the king could protect her through the feast, could delay the request, could use procedural time to handle what needed handling. But Seraphine would be queen in 2 days, and a queen had a different class of leverage than an incoming household, and whatever Draven had decided to do with the thread needed to be done before that shift in leverage completed itself. And Elira had no way of knowing if it would be. She had given him everything she had, the information, the analysis, the one strategically useful suggestion she could offer. She was a fourth-tier servant. That was the full extent of her resources. She had done what she could do, and now she had to wait in a dormitory bunk and hope that the man she'd staked everything on was both willing and fast enough. She had seen his face when he said the word protect. She was trying not to build on that. She was doing an imperfect job of trying not to build on that. She lay down, closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come for a long time. The morning of the ceremony. She was in the kitchen before dawn, which was normal. The head cook was running at full intensity, which was expected. Every station was occupied, every oven was hot, and the controlled chaos of a major production was at maximum pressure, the particular alive quality of a kitchen working at its absolute limit, which was the state in which kitchens were, perversely, most themselves. Elira worked. She was on the 3rd hour of the morning shift when the kitchen door opened and Harwick walked in. He never came below stairs. He sent messengers. He sent stewards. He communicated through intermediaries, and the fact of his personal presence in the kitchen at 7 in the morning on the day of the coronation ceremony told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. He found her at the pastry station. He crossed to her. He looked at her with the expression of a man performing an instruction he found distasteful, which was the specific expression of someone who had been handling distasteful instructions for so long they could perform the expression without feeling it. "The king has been called to an emergency session with the Eastern delegation," he said, keeping his voice low. "He's been in chambers since 5 this morning. He asked me to convey—" "What's the emergency?" Harwick looked at her with mild displeasure at being interrupted by a fourth-tier servant. Then, because apparently whatever message he was carrying required at least the surface appearance of cooperative disclosure. "Border dispute. 2 of the Eastern lords are threatening to withdraw from the coronation in protest of a land designation. It requires the king's direct mediation. He will be in chambers for most of the morning." The morning. The ceremony was at midday. She looked at Harwick and understood, with the cold precision of someone putting pieces into a shape she didn't want to recognize, that the border dispute had arrived on the morning of the coronation at 5 in the morning after 2 years of apparent dormancy. "He asked me to tell you," Harwick continued, "and the slight pause before you was the pause of a man who found it remarkable that a king would be sending messages to kitchen staff, that the documentation protecting your current assignment is in place, that it stands regardless of what happens this morning." He was making sure she knew he'd tried. He was making sure the message got to her before whatever was coming arrived. "Tell him I understand," she said. Harwick looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. The particular look of an old man who had seen a great many things in 63 years and was seeing something now that he didn't have a category for yet. Then he turned and left. 3 minutes later, Vey walked through the kitchen door with 2 members of Seraphine's household behind her and a palace official Elira had never seen before, carrying a formal documentation scroll. The kitchen went quiet in the way kitchens go quiet when something non-kitchen enters the room. The sounds didn't stop, but the energy underneath them did. Vey crossed to Elira's station. Her face was composed and cold and carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who has waited out an obstacle and is now watching it conclude. "Elira Vale," the official said. He unrolled the scroll to its middle. "By formal request of Lady Seraphine Valdris, pending Queen of the Nightfang Empire, and witnessed by senior household, she's documented as essential personnel for the coronation feast preparation," the head cook said loudly from across the kitchen. He had crossed the floor without Elira noticing him move. He was a broad man, 50s, 26 years in the palace kitchens. and he was standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw set. That documentation exists. The king authorized it. The king is currently in an emergency session, Vey said. The documentation you're referencing was an informal notation, not a formal protective order. It has no standing against a household request signed and witnessed by. It has the king's authorization, which the king is not here to confirm. The kitchen was silent now. Everyone in it was still. Elira looked at the documentation scroll. She looked at Vey's face, at the composed certainty in it. She looked at the official, who was holding the scroll with the slightly pained expression of a bureaucrat caught in a power dispute and wishing he were somewhere else. She looked at the head cook, who was standing there with his 26 years and his jaw set and all his good intentions, and she understood with complete clarity that he was going to lose this argument because intention had nothing to do with institutional power, and institutional power right now was standing on Seraphine's side of the room. She looked at all of this. Then she untied her apron. She set it on the counter with both hands, the same way she'd set down every tray she'd ever carried. Carefully, completely, with the full attention she gave everything. The head cook said her name. "It's all right," she said. She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even. She was not all right, but the not all right was hers to carry, and she would carry it later, when there was time. When she was somewhere that was not a kitchen full of people watching her lose something that had taken 7 years to build. "You'll need someone to complete the afternoon pastry," she said to the cook. "Lena knows the specifications." He looked at her with something raw and helpless in his face. "Elira." "It's fine." She looked at him steadily. "Don't fall behind on the feast. It's the king's day." She turned to Vey. "Where am I going?" she said. And Vey told her. And Elira walked through the kitchen, past the stations, past the ovens still burning, past Lena, who was standing at the bread counter with her hands at her sides and her face doing something that would have been very difficult to look at directly, and out the door. She walked down the service corridor through the eastern passage, down 2 flights of stairs, and into the lower holding rooms that the palace used for staff under formal review, which were small and stone and very far from the warm alcove and the chimney heat and a 7-year-old boy's involuntary laugh. She sat down on the bench against the wall. She thought about Kalis waking up this morning and going to the alcove and finding it empty. She thought about the wooden horse he'd left on the flour sack like something he trusted he could come back to. She thought about Draven in an emergency session that had arrived at 5 in the morning with the timing of something designed and placed, and she thought about what he would find when he came out, and she thought about whether the thread was still in his hands or whether it had been cut while he was looking somewhere else. The ceremony was in 3 hours. She had no way to reach anyone. She had no resources, no standing, no mechanism. She was a 4th-tier Omega servant in a holding room below the palace kitchens, and the only things she had were what she'd always had, the knowledge of what was true and the particular stubborn refusal to pretend it wasn't. It would have to be enough. She put her hands in her lap and sat in the silence and waited. Above her, the palace was preparing for a coronation, and 2 floors up and 40 meters north, in a room that smelled like old storage and very little warmth, a wooden horse sat on a flour sack waiting for someone who was not coming back, unless the man who'd promised to hold a thread was fast enough and angry enough and had understood what she'd told him about the nature of the thing he was really fighting. The stone was cold against her back. She straightened anyway. The holding room had no window. That was the particular cruelty of it. Not the cold stone or the narrow bench or the smell of damp and disuse, but the absence of light by which to measure time. Elira had no way of knowing how long she'd been sitting there. An hour, maybe more. The ceremony was at midday, and she had no way of knowing how close midday was, which meant she had no way of knowing whether it had already happened, whether the crown had already been placed, whether the thing that could not be undone had already been done. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, because straightening was the one choice still available to her, and she was going to keep making it. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the careful, quiet footsteps of below-stairs staff. These were the deliberate footsteps of someone moving with purpose and not bothering to soften it. She tracked them, coming from the north passage, not the south, moving fast, stopping at the door. The bolt scraped. The door opened. Draven stood in the doorway with his formal ceremony clothes half assembled. The upper tunic on, the ceremonial collar absent, his jaw set so hard she could see the tension in it from across the room. Behind him, the corridor was empty except for two guards who were facing outward with the deliberate posture of men who had been told to face outward. He looked at her. She stood up. "How long have you been in here?" he said. "I don't know. There's no window." Something moved through his face that was not quite anger and not quite something else. It was the expression of a man encountering a specific fact that rearranges the temperature of everything around it. "Are you injured?" "No." "Come with me." She came. Tut. He moved through the service corridor at a pace that required her to push her stride to match it, and he said nothing while he moved and she said nothing back, and the silence between them had a different quality than any of the silences before. This one had urgency in it, the particular kind of urgency that exists in the minutes before something breaks. They came up 2 flights of stairs, through the passage that connected the service levels to the main east corridor, and into the part of the palace she had rarely been. The formal corridor outside the throne antechamber was not empty. Harwick was there, and Castellan Rowe, and 2 members of the senior guard, and standing slightly apart from the cluster with her hands folded and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who has prepared for this exact moment and is completely ready for it, Seraphine Valdris. She was in her coronation dress. The deep silver gray of it caught the corridor light and held it, and she wore it with the ease of someone who had been preparing for this day for a very long time and had dressed for it accordingly. Her eyes went to Alira the moment they came around the corridor junction. They did not stay on Alira. They moved to Draven, and her expression adjusted with the speed of an excellent strategist recognizing the shape of the ground beneath her. "My king." Her voice was warm, composed, entirely committed to the performance. "The ceremony begins in 40 minutes. The Eastern delegation is resolved," Draven said. His voice was flat. "It was resolved 2 hours ago. I've been looking for you since." A very brief pause. "I was with the temple priest for the final preparations, the formal request." He stopped in the center of the corridor. "The removal order submitted this morning. Did you authorize it personally?" The warm composure did not crack. It shifted. Subtle, the way a building shifts before it settles, everything above it adjusting in a fraction of a second to maintain the surface level. "I authorized a staff review. The concerns were legitimate. The concerns were manufactured." His voice had not risen. That was the part that made the corridor so quiet. There was no shouting, no performance, just a man stating a fact with the particular weight of absolute certainty behind it. "Wren's statement was solicited in exchange for a promotion offer made by your household 3 weeks ago. The 2 secondary witnesses are your personal staff, who have never been below the 2nd floor of this palace. I have documented confirmation of all of this." Seraphine looked at him. She was thinking. He could see it. Not panic, because she was too controlled for panic, but the rapid recalculation of a person identifying which pieces of the structure could still be defended. "The Chamberlain. Wren submitted a retraction this morning, 40 minutes ago, which I suspect you already know." Draven took 1 step toward her, just 1, but the corridor rearranged itself around that step the way rooms rearranged around him. "I want to ask you something, directly, and I want an answer that isn't managed." She looked at him. "All right. Was the Eastern delegation dispute real?" The corridor held its breath. Seraphine's jaw moved, just slightly, the near invisible adjustment of a person making a decision about what to give away. Then, and this was either a strategic choice or the closest she could come to honesty under pressure. "The dispute existed. The timing was accelerated. I needed you occupied this morning." The admission was calibrated to land as honesty while conceding as little ground as possible. Draven recognized the calculation in it. He had made that calculation himself 100 times from the other side of a table. "You needed me occupied so you could complete the removal before I could act on the documentation," he said. "While the man I sent to speak to you this morning delivered a message designed to tell me the issue was contained." He looked at Harwick briefly. Harwick, to his credit, met the look. "I delivered the message I was given, sire. I didn't know what it was for." "I know." Draven returned his attention to Seraphine. "You worked 3 separate angles simultaneously, the request, the border dispute, and the messenger, all executed the same morning." He paused. "You're very good." She looked at him with something in her eyes that might, in a different context, have been satisfaction. I've been managing complex situations for a long time. I know. That's what I wanted in a queen. He said it without softness, which made it worse. I wanted someone sharp enough to run an empire, connected enough to hold its alliances, and capable enough that I could trust the administration when my attention was elsewhere. He stopped. What I needed to know, what I could not know until now, was what you would do with all of that capability when the obstacle was a 7-year-old child. The corridor was absolutely still. Kalis is not an obstacle, Seraphine said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not defensive, something more complex. He's a child who has been allowed to form an attachment that isn't healthy for him. The kitchen worker is not equipped. She's the only person in this palace he trusts. The flatness in Draven's voice had gone. Not loud, not theatrical. Something quieter and more absolute. For 3 years, while every advisor and chamberlain and appointed caregiver failed to reach him, she sat in an alcove with him and handed him warm broth and let him talk when he needed to talk and did not require anything from him in return. She did not report it, not because she was hiding something, but because she understood something the rest of this palace didn't, which is that sometimes what a child needs is not management. Seraphine looked at him, then at Lyra, then back at him. You went to her, she said. Not an accusation, a recognition. That's where this started. She came to you. She came to me because she'd overheard your household planning my son's future without his knowledge or mine. Yes. The silence stretched. The coronation is in 40 minutes, Seraphine said. Her voice had gone back to composed, which was not the same as controlled. It was the kind of composure that exists when everything below it has gone very cold. Are we doing this now, here, in a corridor? I'm doing it now because I don't intend to have this conversation after the crown is on your head. Draven's voice was level again, but a different level, the kind built from decision rather than restraint. I need to know something, and I need you to understand that what you say in the next 30 seconds determines what happens in the next 40 minutes. Seraphine looked at him. She was no longer managing the expression. This, Elira thought, watching from 2 feet behind Draven's right shoulder, was the closest she had seen to the person under the performance. Ask it, Seraphine said. If you become queen today, and in 6 months, Kalis is still going to the kitchen, still choosing to spend his time with someone who is not his appointed staff, what do you do? The question landed in the corridor like a stone dropped in standing water, the rings of it moving outward through every person present. Seraphine was quiet for a long time, long enough that Harwick shifted his weight, long enough that the guards at the end of the corridor maintained their outward-facing posture with the determined rigidity of men pretending very hard not to listen. I'd address it formally, she said finally, through appropriate channels. That's not an answer, that's a process. Her eyes were steady on him. She was measuring something, him, the situation, the cost of various truths. I would remove her. The flatness with which she said it was not cruelty. That was the thing. It was the flat practicality of someone who had organized her worldview around the efficient management of obstacles, and was not, at this point, capable of seeing a 4th-tier kitchen servant as anything else. Draven nodded once. Thank you, he said, for the honesty. What happened next happened fast. He turned. Not fully away from Seraphine, he turned to the side, the pivot of a man who has made a decision and is already in the first step of executing it, which meant his attention had shifted from the conversation that was ending to the problem that was beginning. He looked at Harwick. I need the senior council, all of them, in the antechamber, now. Harwick's eyebrows were doing something complicated, but his body was already moving. Sire, the Eastern Lords are still in the palace. I need them too. The ceremony will be delayed. He was already moving. Send word to the temple priests, 30 minutes. Harwick left at a pace that was nearly running, which was a thing Elira had never seen and suspected most people in the palace hadn't either. Seraphine had not moved. She was standing in the same position, in her coronation dress, in the silver gray that caught the light, and her face had finally settled into something unmanaged. Not hurt, not angry, something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman who had played every piece correctly and was now watching the board clear for reasons she did not fully control. Draven. It was the first time Elira had heard her use his name without the title. He stopped. You're making a decision right now based on how I handled one situation. Her voice was careful, measured, completely sane. I am not a cruel woman. I am a woman who protects what she's building. You know the difference. He turned enough to see her. I know you're not cruel. I've never thought you were cruel. He paused. I think you're capable. I think you're precise. I think you'd run this empire with extraordinary efficiency. Another pause, this one heavier. And I think you'd run my son out of it within 2 years because he's an inconvenience you don't know how to solve any other way. She looked at him for a long moment. You're choosing her, she said. Not with passion, with the flat accuracy of an analyst naming a result. I'm choosing my son. He held her gaze. That's what this has always been about. He turned and walked toward the antechamber. Elira stood in the corridor with Seraphine and the 2 outward-facing guards, and the weight of a very large silence. She did not know what to do with her hands. She put them at her sides. Seraphine looked at her. The look was not warm and not cold. It was the look of a woman doing the particular arithmetic of a person who has just lost something they prepared for extensively and is recalculating every variable. He's going to find out, Seraphine said quietly, that there's a difference between choosing what's right and being able to hold it. Empires aren't run on warmth. I know, Elira said. Seraphine's eyes shifted. You're not afraid of me. I'm 4th-tier kitchen staff. I've been afraid of much smaller things for much longer. It gets exhausting. She kept her voice even. I'm sorry about the coronation. I mean that genuinely. Seraphine looked at her for another moment, the long, assessing look of a woman trying to determine whether what she was seeing was real or a performance. Then she turned and walked back toward the guest quarters, and her footsteps were controlled and even the whole way, and she did not look back. The antechamber held 12 people and the weight of a situation nobody had a precedent for. Draven stood at the front of it. He had not sat. He was not going to sit. He had 2 advisors who were visibly alarmed, 3 Eastern lords who had come in expecting a border resolution and found something else entirely, Castellan Rowe, Treasury Minister Aldrich, Crest, with his tortured protocol expression pushed to its outer limit, and the senior temple official who had arrived midway through and was now standing near the door with the look of a man recalibrating every plan he'd made in the last 6 months. He had also, somewhat remarkably, sent someone to bring Kalis. The boy arrived 10 minutes in, still in his ceremony clothes, his face in the controlled mask. He scanned the room, found Elira standing against the east wall, and the mask changed. Not gone, adjusted. Something loosened behind his eyes. Draven saw it. Elira watched him see it. I'm not going to give you the long version, Draven said to the room. The short version is that the coronation is postponed. Lady Seraphine's household will be given every courtesy in their departure. The Eastern Agreement stands. That's not contingent on the marriage, and I won't let anyone pretend it is. The succession question remains open, which I know is not what anyone in this room wanted to hear, and I don't have a resolution for it today. The room produced a noise that was several conversations starting simultaneously. Draven raised one hand. The conversation stopped. I need the Eastern Lords to stay through tomorrow. I need Harwick and Rowe in my office in an hour. I need everyone else to consider that the alternative to a postponement was a crown placed on the wrong head, and I need you to decide which of those outcomes is actually the problem for an empire. He looked at the room with the flat absolute authority of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in its unpopularity. The room decided. It emptied over the next 10 minutes. The Eastern Lords went with Rowe. Harwick went with Aldrich and a stack of documents. Crest left still wearing the tortured expression. The temple official departed with the particular posture of someone already composing the report he was going to file. The antechamber was left with Draven, Kalis, and Elira. Kalis was looking at his father with the watchful assessment of a 7-year-old who has absorbed a very large amount of complicated information and is working through it systematically. The ceremony isn't happening, he said. Not today. Because of Lady Seraphine. Yes. Kalis processed this. Are you angry? Draven looked at his son for a long moment, and the look had more in it than Elira had ever seen on his face. Not just tiredness, not just the weight of decision, but something more specific, something that was about the boy in front of him. and the 3 years of inadequate reaching, and the involuntary laugh he'd heard through a ventilation shaft, and the distance between knowing something mattered and being present enough to act on it. "I'm disappointed," Draven said. "That's different." Kalis nodded, the slow nod of a child who already knows disappointment is harder to resolve than anger. Then he looked at Elira. "They locked you somewhere," he said. It was flat and certain. "A holding room. For a few hours." His jaw tightened with a sudden fierceness that was his father's exact expression in a smaller face. "That's wrong." "Yes," she said. "It was. Are you leaving now?" She looked at Draven. Draven was looking at her with the same directness he'd had since the first morning in the kitchen. The full attention of a man who did not divide his focus, and in it was something she had been carefully not building on and was finding increasingly difficult not to build on. "That depends on the king," she said. The antechamber was very quiet. Draven took 2 steps toward her, which crossed most of the distance between them, which was not a thing she had prepared for, and said, "I owe you something." "You don't," she said. "I pulled you into this. I walked into it. I let you stay in that room for... You were managing an empire." She kept her voice steady through the effort of keeping it steady. "You don't owe me anything." He looked at her. "My son," he said very quietly, "has said your name more times in the last 3 years than he has said the name of anyone else in this palace, including mine." She had nothing to say to that. There was nothing to say to that. "I want you to stay," he said, "in whatever capacity makes sense, with whatever arrangement gives you standing enough that this can't happen again." He paused. "I understand if that's not something you want. I understand that this week has been..." "I want to stay," she said. It came out before the management did. She felt the absence of the management immediately after, the slight shock of having said the true thing without the buffer of the practical framing. She held his gaze because looking away now would be worse. "All right," he said. Kalis, from 3 feet away, was watching both of them with the expression of someone who is 7 years old and highly observant and is filing something away for later. "I left the horse," he said. Elira looked at him. "I know. It was still there when I went down this morning. I didn't know if you were coming back." "I know." She crossed to him, crouched to his level, looked at his face. The controlled mask almost entirely gone now, just the boy underneath it, carrying the weight of having almost lost something and not having the vocabulary yet to say what that weight felt like. "I'm here." He looked at her, then at his father, then back at her, with the particular assessment of a child who has made a decision. He reached into the pocket of his ceremony jacket and pulled out the wooden horse. He held it out to her. She looked at it. "You keep it," he said, "so you have a reason to stay in the palace." The antechamber was absolutely still. Elira took the wooden horse from his hands with the same care she gave everything she was given, completely, with both hands, with the full weight of her attention. "That's a very good reason," she said. Draven, above her, was looking at his son with the expression of a man for whom something has just named itself that had been present for a long time without a name. And in the temple at the center of the Night Fang Empire, the moon crown sat in its case with the silver of it catching the absent ceremony light, waiting, with the particular patience of things that do not choose wrong, waiting for the moment that was not today, but was coming. The question of what that moment looked like, who stood where, who the crown recognized, what an empire looked like when its king finally understood the difference between a crown held by power and one earned by something older. That question was still in the air. But Draven Kalor was looking at an Omega servant holding his son's wooden horse in the middle of an antechamber that smelled like disrupted ceremony and hard decisions, and the question was starting, for the first time, to feel like it might already have its answer. He just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. The empire was 40 minutes away from having no queen, and the woman who might have been the reason for that was standing in the room. The empire did not collapse. That was the first thing. Draven had expected the worst version. The Eastern lords withdrawing, the alliance fracturing, Harwick delivering the particular brand of careful told-you-so that 63 years of palace service had sharpened into a precise instrument. He had expected the machinery of the court to seize up the way machinery seizes when you remove a component it was built around. What he got instead was something more complicated and, in its way, more honest. The Eastern Lords stayed. Not because they were happy. Lord Marin of the Second Eastern Province delivered a 40-minute session of controlled displeasure that Draven sat through without interruption and without apology. But because the land agreement was real, and their interests were real, and political men, in the end, followed their interests before their feelings. The alliance held. It held without Seraphine, which told him something he filed away carefully. The alliance had been built on his name, not on hers, and he had spent 2 years believing otherwise. Harwick did not say, "Told you so." What he did, sitting across the desk on the evening after the failed ceremony with a cup of cold tea and the expression of a man finishing a very long week, was look at Draven for a long moment and then say, "She would have been good at the administrative work." I know. The Empire needs someone who can manage the administrative work. I know that too. I'm not suggesting anything, Harwick said. I'm noting a gap. Noted. Draven looked at him. Is that everything? Harwick picked up his cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. Your son seems better. It was not a political observation. It was, coming from Harwick, something close to the nearest he could get to one. He is, Draven said. Thank you for noticing. Seraphine left the palace on the second morning. She did it the way she did everything, with the precise efficiency of someone who had decided how this would look and was executing the decision fully. Her household was assembled and loaded before the primary corridor traffic began. She took her formal farewell with Draven in the reception hall with the same composure she'd brought to every public moment in the palace, which was to say completely and without visible seam. They stood in the hall alone after the household had filed out, in the specific silence of two people who had been adversarial and were now finding the shape of whatever came after that. I want you to know, she said, that I don't blame the girl. Draven looked at her. I blame the situation. I blame the fact that nobody told me the child was untouchable until I'd already committed to a method. She paused. I also want you to know that what I did was rational. I need you to understand that I'm not going to apologize for being rational. I'm not asking for an apology. I know. That's almost more irritating. The corner of her mouth moved, not warmth, but the ghost of the performance dropping for a moment. You're a good king, Draven. You're going to have a very difficult time finding someone who can manage what I would have managed. Probably, he said. I hope you find them anyway. She left. He stood in the empty hall for a few minutes. He was honest with himself, which was something he required of himself with the same regularity that he required it of his council. He was honest that Seraphine had not been wrong about the gap, had not been wrong that an empire needed capable administration, had not been wrong about most of the strategic calculus that had led her to every decision she'd made. She had simply been wrong about the one thing that had turned out to be the only thing that mattered. He had almost been wrong about it too. That was the part he sat with. That was the part that deserved the weight he was giving it. Not her failure, but his own near miss. He had come within 40 minutes of a crown being placed on a head that would have been efficient and capable, and entirely willing to remove the one warm thing in a cold palace because it was operationally inconvenient. He had almost let that happen because he had been looking at political fitness and not asking the question that was actually the right one. He had needed a fourth-tier kitchen servant to ask it for him. There was a lesson in that. Sitting at the bottom of everything like a stone, you had to go deep to find. It was not a comfortable lesson. It was the kind of thing a man had to turn over in his hands for a long time before he understood what shape it was. The shape was this. Power makes you efficient at the wrong questions. You get very good at asking whether a thing is strategically sound, politically viable, administratively manageable. You get worse, over years, at asking whether it is true, whether it is real, whether the thing you are building is the thing you actually want or just the thing that fits inside the system you already have. Mira had always been the one who asked the real questions. He had not understood until now exactly what he had lost when he lost her. He found Elira in this kitchen 3 days after the ceremony that didn't happen. She was at the pastry station, which was where she always was. And she didn't look up when the door opened because she had been trained by 7 years to assess visitors by their footstep rather than their entrance. And his footstep she had apparently learned already. He crossed to the station. The head cook found urgent reasons to be at the far end of the kitchen. The rest of the staff managed, with impressive coordination, to develop a collective interest in the preparation area nearest the north wall. You're still here, he said. You told me to stay. I told you I wanted you to stay. That's different. He leaned against the counter beside the station, which was an unusual posture for him in a kitchen, and seemed to briefly astonish two of the younger staff who caught a glimpse of it before looking away. I wanted you to have the choice. She looked at him. I made it. You did. He was quiet for a moment. I want to make your position formal. There's no title for what you've been doing. We'd have to create one. Something with actual standing, so the documentation doesn't depend on my presence in the building to hold. She turned the dough. What would it be called? I don't know yet. Something real, not ceremonial. He paused. You'd be responsible for Kalis's informal welfare. The spaces the Chamberlain doesn't cover. The kitchen alcove. The conversations he needs to have in the places he feels safe having them. Another pause. And probably more than that, eventually. You have a way of reading a situation clearly that this palace has been short of for a while. She kept her hands moving. You're describing an advisor. I'm describing someone whose judgment I trust. The title can sort itself out. She was quiet for a moment. The pastry folded under her hands with the familiar efficiency of something practiced to the point of reflex. And she was aware of him standing beside her in the way she was always aware of him, with the particular heightened attention she'd stopped pretending wasn't there. There will be people who say it's inappropriate, she said. A fourth-tier servant with formal standing. Yes, Harwick will have opinions. Harwick has opinions about everything. He expresses them and then he adjusts. That's why I've kept him for 20 years. She looked at him. You've thought about all of this. I've been thinking about all of this since the morning I walked into this kitchen, and you looked up from the oven and decided in about 4 seconds whether I was worth talking honestly to. He met her gaze with the directness she'd come to understand as simply how he was. Not performance, not strategy, just a man who had decided long ago that looking away cost more than it saved. For what it's worth, I was impressed by the 4 seconds. She felt the warmth of it in a way she didn't try to manage. She let it be there. It was real, and she was done pretending that real things needed containment. I'll take the position, she said. Good. I have conditions. He looked at her with what was almost amusement. Of course you do. Lena gets promoted to second-tier lead. She covered for me the whole week, and she never once used it for anything. She turned back to the dough, hands moving. The head cook gets the additional staff he's been asking Harwick for since winter. And whatever you do with the Chamberlain situation, Kalis gets a say in who replaces Wren. He's 7, but he's also the one who has to live with the choice. Draven was quiet. Those aren't large asks, she said. No. His voice had a quality she couldn't immediately name. They're not. Then those are my conditions. Done, he said. All 3. She nodded, kept working, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had run out of the need to fill space with words and had arrived at the place where presence was sufficient. Kalis took the news about Wren the way he took most difficult things. He went quiet, processed it with the thoroughness of a small person who trusted his own thinking, and then came to Elira in the alcove 2 days later with a specific question. Did he always think badly of me? Or did they change him? She sat with it. I think he was offered something he wanted very much, she said carefully. And I think getting things we want very much can change what we're willing to do. That's not the same as always being bad. But it means you can't trust it when someone is good, because they might not stay good. It means you pay attention, she said. You don't stop trusting. You just keep watching, both things at once. She looked at him. You've been doing that your whole life. You're actually very good at it. He considered this. I didn't trust Seraphine. No, I was right. You were. But I also wasn't right about everything. I thought if she left, everything would be fine. He pulled his knees up, the familiar posture. But it doesn't feel fine. It just feels different. She nodded. That's because fine isn't the thing. Fine comes later, maybe. What you have right now is real, which is harder than fine, but it lasts longer. He sat with that for a long moment. Then, what's real? She looked at the alcove stones, the warm chimney wall, the flour sacks that had held this small space together for 3 years. Your father came and got me out of that room, she said. That's real. He didn't send someone. He came himself, with his ceremony clothes half on, and he walked fast enough that I had to push to keep up. Kalis was quiet. "And you left the horse," she said. "I told you, so you had a reason to come back." "I know, that's what I mean." She looked at him. "That's what real looks like." He looked at the wooden horse, which was sitting on the flour sack between them, where it had sat since she'd returned it. He picked it up, turned it in his hands once, set it back down. "My mother used to say that the people worth keeping are the ones who stay when there's nothing left to stay for," he said. It came out carefully, the way he said everything about his mother. Handled, precious, offered with the full weight of something that cost him. "She was right," Elira said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "I think you would have liked her." Something moved through Elira's chest that she did not try to name or contain. She let it move through. "I think I would have too," she said. "What?" The formal appointment was documented 3 weeks later. It was not a grand ceremony. Draven had specifically avoided making it grand. Grand would have turned it into a political statement, which would have required everyone present to take a position on it, which would have spent more energy on the politics of the thing than on the thing itself. Instead, it was a private documentation in the presence of Harwick and Castellan Row and the official palace record keeper, in the king's working office with the maps on the walls and the uncapped pen. The title they'd settled on, after considerable back and forth with Harwick, who had opinions about titles with the particular fervor of a man for whom words were structural. Keeper of the prince's household. It was not glamorous. It was not ceremonial. It had legal standing and a salary and a formal position in the palace record that meant no household manager, incoming or otherwise, could issue a removal order against it without the king's direct authorization in writing. It meant she existed on the record. It meant she could not be made invisible by someone else's paperwork. Harwick had looked at her during the documentation process with the expression of a man who had been in this palace for 63 years and was adding something new to his understanding of how it worked. "You'll need to learn the council protocols," he said. It was not welcoming and not hostile. It was just a fact, delivered in the way Harwick delivered all facts, plainly, as if reality were a courtesy he was extending to you. "I learn things quickly," she said. "You'll need to." "I know." He had looked at her for another moment. Then, with the slight adjustment around his eyes, she was beginning to understand the Harwick equivalent of warmth. "The head cook is very pleased about the additional staff." "Good." He said, and I'm quoting directly, that it was about time someone in this palace had the sense to fix what he'd been asking about for 3 years. She kept her expression neutral. "I'll pass along his gratitude." Harwick's eyes adjusted again. He went back to the documentation. It was late autumn before things settled into their new shape. The shape that was not the old shape and was not the interrupted shape of the ceremony that didn't happen, but something that had grown out of the wreckage of both into its own distinct form. Kalis had a new chamberlain, a young man named Tor, who had been selected partly by Draven and partly by Kalis himself in the process of 2 weeks of careful watching and one direct conversation in which Kalis had asked Tor, with complete seriousness, whether he thought kitchen broth was an acceptable evening activity. Tor had said he'd never tried it but was open to forming an opinion. Kalis had approved him. The kitchen alcove was still the alcove. That had not changed, and Elira had not wanted it to change. Some things derived their value from their constancy, from the fact that they remained themselves regardless of what happened around them. The stones were still warm from the old chimney. The flour sacks still kept the cold off the floor. Kalis still arrived sometimes with his knees drawn up and his face in the controlled mask, and left with the fractional loosening that meant the real boy had come out from behind the fortifications for a while. What changed was that Elira now sometimes left the kitchen at the end of the day and walked the upper corridors without feeling like a person who had wandered into a territory that didn't belong to her. She had access now to the rooms and records that her work required. She had a desk in the small office adjacent to Kalis's schoolroom. She had a formal position in the palace's daily schedule. She was, in the language of the palace record, a person who existed. It took longer than she would have admitted to stop waiting for it to be taken away. The first real snowfall came in the last week of autumn. Draven found her on the east balcony, the one off the second floor that faced the inner courtyard and was too exposed to be fashionable in cold weather, which meant it was empty most of the time. She had been watching the snow come down in the particular absorptive way of someone for whom snow had historically meant more work, more cold, more difficulty, and was finding, this year, that it meant something less functional and more simply what it was. He came to stand beside her without asking whether it was welcome, which was, she had discovered, how he moved through most spaces. Not presumptuous, just certain of his own motion in a way that meant he didn't require permission for presence. They stood together and watched the snow. "The Eastern delegation is coming back in the spring," he said after a while, "for the renegotiation. Yes. And probably to look at the succession question again. Harwick will want a plan ready before they arrive." "Harwick wants a plan ready for everything." "Yes." A pause. "He's not wrong to want one." She was quiet. She knew what was underneath this conversation, and she was not going to help him get to it faster or slower than he was going to get to it himself. She had learned that about him. He arrived at things at his own pace, and the pace was not slowness, it was thoroughness. He didn't say things until he knew what they were. "I'm not looking for a political alliance," he said. "I know. What happened with Seraphine? That's not something I want to do again. I'm not going to build something on strategic fitness and hope the rest of it follows." She was looking at the courtyard. The snow was collecting on the stone edges of the fountain basin that would be dry until spring. "What are you building?" she said. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. "I don't know the full shape of it yet," he said. "I know what it's made of. That's where I am right now." She held his gaze. "What's it made of?" He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitation, the thorough kind. 3 years of a boy going somewhere in a palace and coming back different, every time, without exception. He paused. "A woman who wrote something down because she wanted the distinction to matter, who walked into my office with flour on her hands and told me the truth without softening it." Another pause. "The way you looked at me when I came to get you out of that room, like you'd been waiting but you weren't going to say so." She breathed out slowly. "I wasn't going to say so," she said. "I know." The corner of his mouth. "I'm saying it." The snow came down around them on the east balcony, quiet and indifferent to kingdoms and their complications, and Elira Vale stood with the warmth of him at her shoulder and the formal record of her existence 3 weeks old in the palace archive, and she understood something about herself that she had not understood clearly before this moment. She had spent 7 years becoming invisible because visibility had always meant cost. The flour-dusted apron and the piece of twine and the practiced silence had not been a strategy. They had been a shelter. Walls built before she was old enough to know she was building them, maintained so long they had started to feel like skin. And then a boy had found a warm alcove and fallen asleep against the chimney stones, and she had sat down on the floor 3 feet away and not required anything of him. And somewhere in the years that followed, she had been made visible again. Not by force, not by politics, but by the slow accumulation of being seen by someone who looked at the true shape of things and said what they were. First the boy, then the father. She was still learning what to do with the being seen. She suspected she would be learning it for a while, but she was not afraid of it anymore. Fear was the language of a person who believed that being known was the same as being vulnerable, and she had seen enough, in this cold palace and its alcove and its office and its east balcony in the first snow of autumn, to know that the two things were not the same at all. Being known was just being real. And real, as she had told a 7-year-old boy not so long ago, was harder than fine but lasted longer. She reached out and set her hand over Draven's where it rested on the balcony rail. He turned his hand over without looking at it, without ceremony, with the simple and complete attention of a man who had finally stopped waiting to act on the thing he already knew. His fingers closed around hers. The empire lay below them in the first snow of the year, the courtyard white and still, the stable yard sounds muffled and far, and the palace that had been a tomb for 3 years breathing out, slowly, like a living thing remembering how. Inside, somewhere in the east wing that had been returned to its proper warmth, a 7-year-old prince was asleep with a wooden horse on the table beside his bed, the horse that had been left as a reason, the reason that had become everything.